In today's video, we'll be diving into one of the most violent and disturbing massacres in California history. At the center of it all was a man named Gerald Cruz, a self-proclaimed high priest who claimed he had supernatural powers and was able to place curses on people. He led a cult-like group known as the Cause, and their belief system was based on astrology, voodoo, and white supremacy. At Gerald's side was James David Beck, a father of 3 who had once lived a normal life, until he met Gerald. Gerald came from a fractured family riddled with secrets and violence. On the other hand, James came from a seemingly normal family and was once a churchgoer and a devoted Pentecostal. James gave up everything, his children, his faith, and eventually his humanity to become Gerald's enforcer. He punished members and carried out brutal commands without question. Members were tortured, electrocuted, and beaten into submission. Women were threatened at gunpoint. Even infants weren't spared. In May of 1990, fueled by a desire to eliminate a perceived threat, Gerald gathered his followers and planned a brutal massacre. Armed with knives, bats, and military-style weapons, they descended onto a home in Salida, California. The people inside, some rivals and some simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, had no idea what was coming. By the end of that night, 4 people were dead. One man's throat was cut so violently, it severed all the way to his spine. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, on the weapons, and even on the killers themselves. Gerald Dean Cruz was born in Modesto, California in March 1962. His mother, Hortensia Cruz, had 6 children with her first husband, Jesus Hernandez, before Gerald was born. Hortensia testified that Gerald's biological father was Asencio Cruz. But because Asencio had gone to Mexico and didn't return, Hortensia listed a friend, Lawrence Jimmy Cox, as the father on Gerald's birth certificate. Gerald's half-sister, Esperanza Hope Castillo Cruz, who everyone called Hope, also backed up the story that Hortensia and Asencio were Gerald's biological parents. Hope was around 21 when Gerald was born, and Marlene Hernandez, Gerald's half-sister, said that she didn't see Hortensia visibly pregnant before Gerald was born. Before Gerald was brought home, Hope was ill in bed at a farmhouse. Marlene believed that Hope was Gerald's mother because Hope had been away for some time before Gerald's birth, and when Gerald was brought home, Hope told Marlene that some lady gave her the baby to take care of. Marlene remembered frequent fights between Hope and their mother over who would take responsibility for raising Gerald. She said they were screaming at him all the time. When Gerald was born, the family ran a restaurant and only kept it going for about 5 or 6 months between 1961 and 1962. After they closed the restaurant, the family moved on to fruit-picking work in Fresno from 1962 to 1964. During that period, they lived out of their car, sleeping on a mattress next to it. When Asencio returned from Mexico, he had no idea that he had a son waiting for him. However, 2-year-old Gerald had a different last name, which was Cox. As a young boy, Gerald heard from Hortensia's first husband that Asencio wasn't actually his father, and that his real dad was a drunk. Gerald later went to his mother for answers. She confirmed that she was his mother, and he told her, "Well, as long as I know who my mother is, I don't care who my father is." Asencio had no idea that Hope and her siblings were actually Hortensia's biological children. To keep him in the dark, Hortensia introduced them as her nieces and nephews, because she didn't want him to know she'd been married before. Hortensia told her other children not to call her mom or mother in front of him. Asencio was told that Gerald's half-brother Armando Hernandez was just a friend, and that Marlene's real mother had passed away, and that Hortensia was just the aunt taking care of her. By the time Gerald was about 3, the family had moved to Oakdale and settled on Drummond Sproul's ranch. In exchange for a place to live, the family worked around the ranch doing chores. About a year after moving into the ranch, Asencio married Hortensia. In 1970, the family purchased a large trailer to live in right there on the ranch, and they decided to go back to the restaurant business, which did not last long. We will detail why in a little bit. Sharon Dennis, Gerald's 4th-grade teacher, remembered him as Gerald Cox, not Cruz. She said another school staff member confided in her that Gerald's family situation wasn't what it seemed. He was living with a woman and a girl he thought were his mother and sister, but in reality, the woman was his grandmother, and the girl was actually his mother. In either third or fourth grade, Gerald came back into the classroom during recess and overheard his teacher talking with someone else. They were wondering who his real mom was. Gerald walked out immediately. Later, when he asked Ozencio about it, Ozencio told him that Hortensia had a sister who had died, and all the kids in the house were nieces and nephews, not her children. When Gerald was 14 years old, Marlene told him that his real parents were Hope and Jim Cox. Despite the confusion around his parentage, Hortensia said that Gerald wasn't the kind of kid who got into trouble often, and he was rarely physically disciplined. However, in reality, Gerald was punished with a stick, an umbrella, switch, a rope, the cord from an iron, and a coat hanger. Despite this, Gerald didn't view this treatment as abuse. He genuinely believed his mother raised him properly. Hortensia was violent in front of the kids in other ways. For example, when Gerald was about 18 months old, Hortensia had a pet canary that was eaten by a cat. She actually slit the cat's stomach open to try and see if the bird was inside. When Gerald was about 17, a neighbor's dog had wandered into their yard. Hortensia, furious, took an axe and cut off the dog's back legs while it was trying to escape under a fence. Gerald had more than one head injury throughout his life. When he was only about 6 months old, Hope accidentally dropped him, and he hit his head on a concrete porch. He cried, developed a bump, and seemed pretty uncomfortable that day, but the family couldn't afford a doctor, so they just did their best to comfort him. When Gerald was around 4 years old, he was in a car that came to a sudden stop, and he went straight through the windshield. He was left stunned and weak, but the family didn't think the injuries were serious and decided not to seek medical care. At some point, Gerald was hit in the head with a rubber mallet by someone he knew. When Gerald was around 4 years old, the family decided to go back into the restaurant business in Houston. Gerald, along with other family members, worked there, and for a while it was a happy time. They were doing well, even managing to take some business away from a nearby pool hall. But things took a dark turn one night when the owners of the pool hall bombed the restaurant. The police didn't show up until an hour and a half later, and by then Gerald's family had already fled, leaving all their belongings behind. Gerald ended up dropping out of high school in the 10th grade. Hortensia had some odd beliefs which could have influenced Gerald's thinking. Hope married a man named Carlos Sabalos, and her mother believed that he was a witch doctor who placed a voodoo spell on Hope before they got married. Gerald believed he needed to learn voodoo to break the spell Carlos had cast on her, and Hortensia believed that Gerald eventually managed to break the spell. James David Beck was raised in Oakdale, California, and when he was around 17, his father was sent to prison after it came to light that he had molested his 2 younger sisters. Following this, James's parents divorced. Not long after, his mother married her ex-husband's brother. As a teenager and young adult, James, who had a Pentecostal background, was very involved in his church. He regularly attended the Bethel Assembly of God in Oakdale, and his brother Stephen said James knew the Bible inside and out. James was always outgoing, upbeat, and generous, despite the family not having a lot of money. James was described as someone who was very much a follower, and he tended to take on the personality and beliefs of the people he spent time with. In 1978, he married a woman named Barbara, and they went on to have 3 kids. The family lived in a spacious home that even had a pool. James attended oil well drilling school and worked in the oil industry for a time. Later, he transitioned into flooring installation. But things weren't perfect at home. Barbara struggled with drinking and drugs, and she wasn't the most attentive parent. On the other hand, James was described as a good father. After his marriage to Barbara ended, he was granted custody of their children. He moved back in with his mother and stepfather, who helped take care of the kids. His stepsister and former cousin, Christy Schulze, described him as gentle and attentive. The kids adored him, and he wasn't just good with his own children either. Christy's kids loved him too, but then something shifted. After the divorce, James met Gerald, and he started spending more and more time with him and his circle of friends. Slowly, his connection to his kids, and even the rest of his family, started to fade. James's sister Angela said he just wanted to be around Gerald, and that he eventually became a person she didn't even recognize. His brother Stephen noticed the change too, saying that James didn't seem to care about anything or anybody anymore. Stephen remembered James saying chilling things like, "I'll take your soul," and even threatening to kill their sister Debbie over some sort of money issue. Stephen's own infant son was threatened too, and James once threatened to put a curse on his own children. Raymond Greer, a longtime church friend, said that after the divorce, James wasn't the same person. He seemed lost, defeated, and said he didn't think even God could help him anymore. In 1982, James met a woman named Rosemary McLaughlin, and within a year, they started dating. Things were good at first. 2 years in, they were living in Oakdale together, talking about marriage, and seemed genuinely happy. Stephen Perkins had grown up with Gerald, and James's family were close family friends of the Perkins. James and Gerald were also friends with a man named Ronald Willie, and they all met in 1985. When Ronald left for a 1-year trade school in Phoenix in '86 and came back to California in '87, he noticed that things had definitely changed. Ronald said that James and Gerald were now inseparable, but it was clear that Gerald was running the show. James would basically do whatever Gerald said. Jennifer Starn first met both Gerald and James in 1986, when she was just 15 years old and still in high school. By July 1987, Jennifer and Gerald started dating. She was 16 and he was 25. That year they started living together, and not long after, James moved in with them too. Over the course of their relationship, Gerald and Jennifer had 3 children together. James was also close friends with a man named Richard Vieira. James, Richard, Rosemary, Stephen, Gerald, Jennifer, and the kids were all living together in a house on Claret Court in Modesto at some point. Rosemary stayed there for only 6 to 8 months for reasons we will get into later on. At the time, Rosemary, James, Richard, and Stephen were the ones in the household with actual jobs, but all their paychecks went to Gerald and James. Gerald and James ran that house like a strange religious cult. In that house, when Gerald gave an order, that was the end of the discussion. Gerald's word was everybody's law. He handed out punishments, and James enforced them. They'd say, "That's the way it's going to be," and that was that. Gerald was the self-proclaimed leader of something he called the Cause, which was supposed to be the advancement of mankind. Gerald claimed he was a high priest with supernatural powers, saying he could place curses on people, and James believed him. Gerald held the title of the leader of the Cause, while James was considered the enforcer. Gerald was described as a charismatic leader who demanded complete loyalty and was skilled at emotionally manipulating those around him. Although both Gerald and James were considered the leaders of the group, Gerald was the one who truly called the shots. James wouldn't speak unless Gerald gave him permission, and he followed Gerald's lead without question. Over time, James started to mirror Gerald's behavior. Gerald's group believed in Satanism, astrology, voodoo, and white supremacy. They also believed in magic and the occult, claiming these practices would bring benefits to its members. The Cause had a sort of initiation where Gerald would have them sign an oath, cut their hand, and mark the paper with their bloody fingerprint to prove their devotion. In Gerald's journal, there were signatures and fingerprints from people like James, Ronald, and Rosemary, who had supposedly pledged loyalty to the Cause. After Rosemary completed the initiation, James and Gerald told her it was symbolic. After that, she belonged to them. The Cause became sick, distorted, and perverted, and it was Gerald's idea of some type of twisted control over people. We do not have many details on how the group operated or its development. This was likely due to the fact that everyone involved was too scared to speak up. James himself said that he had taken an oath, and if he broke it, people would be hurt. It was likely that Gerald had threatened to harm James's family if he spoke out about the group. Professor Richard Ufshe later pressed him, stating, "Gerald Cruz is threatening to have your children killed if you talk." James didn't confirm or deny this, but he did become visibly upset and started crying. James talked about Satanism and the occult, and at one point he and Gerald tried to convince a woman to join a satanic church. It was clear that James's entire belief system had been flipped upside down. An expert opined that James suffered from shattered faith syndrome, which happens when someone like James, a Pentecostal follower, finds he can no longer believe in the church's teachings and breaks from the church. James Moyers, a psychotherapist, noted that such individuals often experience a compulsive search for meaning in their lives, desperate to fill the void left by the loss of their religious beliefs. James's gradual loss of his belief in the church, which had once been central to his life, seemed to create a void that he struggled to fill, and Gerald's teachings seemed to offer him the sense of direction and purpose that he had been missing. Gerald controlled the group members, including Jennifer, through violence. However, James was never punished like the others. He might get scolded, but that was it. What stands out is that James didn't need to be physically tortured like the others in order to accept orders from Gerald. This suggested that Gerald's control over James was at least as powerful, if not stronger, than it was over other members of the group. Although Gerald denied the abuse and tortures, these were recorded in the diaries members were told to keep. There was no mention of James being tortured in the diaries. He was, in fact, the one carrying out the punishments under Gerald's instructions. There was this so-called punishment wheel that Gerald, James, and Stephen created. It had various punishments written on it. If someone messed up or made them angry, they had to spin the wheel, and wherever it landed would be their punishment. Once when Rosemary tried to leave James, she fled from the house and hid down the block. James and Stephen chased her down, and when they eventually found her, they threw her face first against their van and dragged her back to Claret Court. As she was going up the stairs, James kicked her in the back. Another time, someone in the group lost an envelope that had a few postage stamps in it, and somehow, that became a reason to humiliate and terrify Rosemary. In front of Gerald, James, Richard, Jennifer, and Stephen, she was forced to open her mouth. Then Gerald shoved a loaded rifle into it and threatened to kill her, telling her that he was going to cut off her head and keep it as a trophy. He then turned the gun on Jennifer, forcing it into her mouth while asking her, "Are you going to get your shit together, or are you going to die?" Rosemary was once even locked in a bathroom by Gerald and James for 3 to 4 hours. The relationship between James and Rosemary started to fall apart after James told her he had to give her to Gerald, because in his words, that was the thing to do. Gerald echoed that, telling her marrying her was the only way he could truly control her and prevent her from leaving. Finally, in December 1988, Rosemary left to go to her parents' house for Christmas and never went back. She had left behind everything she owned at the house. Richard was extremely obedient. If Gerald or James told him to do something, he would do it without hesitation. Sometimes they'd even make him stand for long stretches of time, just to show discipline. Gerald would tell Richard when to go to bed, what he could do during the day, and how to behave. James also gave directions, though not as frequently, and there were reports that Richard would be slapped and punched if he did not do as expected. Gerald had a Scorpion stun gun, and he'd use it on Richard without warning, just zap him out of nowhere. The jolts were so painful that Richard would scream and jump every time it happened. At one point, Richard was even forced to shock himself. And Jennifer wasn't spared either. Gerald shocked her twice with the same stun gun. Gerald would force Richard to stand in the middle of the room, then punch him in the stomach as hard as he could. Every single time, Gerald would order Richard to stand still and take it. And Richard wasn't the only one. Stephen endured the same kind of abuse. They were both treated like slaves, beaten for minor mistakes, and even electrocuted as punishment. Stephen eventually fled to live with his parents. Stephen left home around 1987, at about 20 years old, to live with Gerald's group, and he stayed with them for about 18 months. One night, he and Richard came home early and walked in on something they never expected. They found Jennifer and her younger sister Cindy having oral sex. Later, when Stephen told Gerald about what he'd seen, it sparked a fight between him and Jennifer. Jennifer outright denied the whole thing. That night, Stephen went with Jennifer to a house where she said there was some work to be done. As soon as he walked through the door, he was blindsided and had a piece of wood smashed into his face. He was punched, kicked, and even had his pants pulled down so they could kick him in the groin. Then the people there tied an extension cord around his feet and electrocuted him. The shock was so severe that it caused 2 of his toes to fuse together, leaving permanent scars. Stephen claimed that neither Gerald nor James had tortured him or used a stun gun on him. He denied any abuse outright. However, many people witnessed the abuse. Witnesses also saw James beat Stephen repeatedly, sometimes at Gerald's request, other times on his own. The abuse wasn't limited to beatings. Stephen was subjected to torturous practices, including being shocked with an orange extension cord, which they called the orange line treatment, and enduring forced acts of sodomy and bestiality. Cynthia, Jennifer's sister, first met James around 1987 when she was just 16. Over the next couple of years, from 87 to 89, Cynthia worked with James, Stephen, and Richard, installing vinyl and hardwood flooring. Once when Cynthia and Stephen were on a job, Stephen accidentally sliced through an orange extension cord with a saw and got shocked. Months later, Cynthia walked into the house and saw Stephen on the floor on his hands and knees, sanding a gun cabinet like his life depended on it. That same orange extension cord was lying nearby. James and Gerald were sitting off to the side, and as Cynthia entered, Gerald told her to flip the light switch next to the door. She did, and immediately, Stephen started convulsing on the floor, screaming in pain like a fish out of water. Cynthia quickly flipped the switch off. Stephen was moaning from the pain, and Gerald and James were laughing. She noticed that the exposed wires from the cord had been duct-taped around Stephen's toes, with the other end of the cord plugged into a wall outlet activated by the light switch. As a result, the electricity would turn on and shock him. Due to this orange line treatment, Stephen's feet were burned, very infected and covered in open wounds. Cynthia wasn't spared either. Gerald also shoved a rifle into her mouth and threatened to pull the trigger because he believed that she stole one of his guns. During the period Stephen was living with the group, his father, Stephen Sr., saw him 2 or 3 times. Back then, Stephen was a big guy, 6'5", nearly 370 pounds, and full of life. Outgoing, happy, the kind of person who could light up a room. But when Stephen returned home at the end of September 1989 to install some flooring, he wasn't the same person. He had 2 black eyes, a shattered nose, a mark on his forehead, and a chipped tooth. His feet were in bad shape, with 2 toes on each foot fused together due to severe infection. He'd lost 125 pounds and had become quiet, withdrawn, and moody. He wouldn't answer the phone, refused to go outside, and had developed severe claustrophobia. His parents tried to ask what had happened to him, but he never said a word about his time with Gerald and James. Just 4 days after Stephen returned home, he was rushed to the hospital because he was having severe breathing difficulties. That's when his father found out the full extent of what his son had endured. He had visible shackle marks above his ankles, extreme athlete's foot, and large bruises covering his chest. The bruises were so extensive that they obscured the X-ray, making it impossible to determine if any ribs had been broken. He was also suffering from ulcers, a ruptured spleen, and a shattered breastbone. The physical damage was only part of it. Emotionally, Stephen was unraveling. Fearing he might harm his parents or others, he voluntarily checked himself into a psychiatric unit. His father noticed he was starting to experience mental lapses. Stephen sometimes couldn't even remember what day or month it was. Gerald told Stephen exactly what to say if anyone asked about his injuries. Blame it on a motorcycle crash, which he did. Strangely enough, even after fleeing to his parents' home, Stephen kept in touch with Gerald, despite everything that Gerald had done to him. Gerald's cruelty extended to his own child and the mother of his children. He would beat his girlfriend Jennifer with a cane or other objects. Gerald and James once handcuffed her and left her stuck on the couch for an hour. Whenever Gerald thought Jennifer had gotten out of line or they fought, he would threaten to kill her. He would tell Jennifer, "The only way out of this relationship is when one of us dies." She admitted she stayed with Gerald out of fear because she genuinely believed that if she left, he would kill her. On January 6, 1990, when Jennifer was roughly 2 months pregnant, Gerald shoved her to the ground, then kicked her in the stomach and between her legs. The attack was so vicious that it left her bleeding. Terrified and in pain, Jennifer ran for her life, barefoot, without even a jacket. She managed to make it to a women's shelter, where she stayed for 4 days. But then Gerald reached out to her, asking her to come back. He acted kind, like he'd changed, and so Jennifer moved back in with him. The abuse was not limited to Jennifer. Their daughter, Alexandra, suffered just as horrifically at Gerald's hands. Jennifer had Alexandra in July of 1988. Later that same year, James, Gerald, and Richard set up a tape recorder next to her crib, and while she was drifting off to sleep, crept up and screamed at her. The sudden noise woke Alexandra, who started screaming and crying. The tape of this unsettling event was later played in court for the jury. Gerald would hit Alexandra with a fly swatter or ruler on her tiny legs and bottom. James would tie Gatorade bottles to her ankles as she was learning to crawl, and if she cried, he would give her ice-cold water until she found it difficult to breathe. Gerald would also dunk her in ice-cold water and spray her with a water bottle, claiming it would make her lungs stronger. Jennifer said that Gerald might have wanted to strengthen Alexandra's lungs because an astrological chart indicated that she had weak lungs. When Alexandra was less than 6 months old, Gerald would punish her by locking her in a dark room, only allowing Jennifer to feed, hold, or change her every 6 hours. And if Jennifer tried to stop him, he would beat her. Alexandra was bow-legged, and the doctor had said that there were problems with her hips. Gerald asked James to build a special rack for Alexandra to help her strengthen her legs, improve her posture, and learn to stand. He said that his goal was to help her become strong physically, emotionally, and mentally. Before Alexandra even turned 1, Gerald would use the rack to suspend her in a halter, then attach mason jars filled with water to her legs. He'd deliberately make her cry just to watch her legs struggle up and down from the weight. She would be stuck there for hours, and if she cried, they would pour cold water on her until she stopped. In his defense, Gerald said that he used baby food jars, not mason jars. Then there was what Gerald called clappings, where he'd slap the back or side of Alexandra's head so hard it left bruises inside her ears. As she learned to walk, Gerald would ask Alexandra if she wanted a clapping and laugh as he saw her respond by collapsing to the ground and hiding her head between her hands in terror. In late 1989, after Stephen Perkins had moved back home, Gerald moved into a studio apartment at 4510 Finney Road, a residential area of Salida, California. The property at Finney Road was a cluster of small homes and trailers and was known to its residents as the camp. He was living there with his pregnant girlfriend Jennifer and their 2 children. Around the same time, James and Richard moved into a large prowler trailer parked right in front of Gerald's apartment. Jason LaMarche lived in a small trailer about 20 feet away from Gerald's apartment, though he also lived with his mother in Ripon. Jason first met James, Gerald, and Richard around March 1990 when they were actively trying to grow their group. They were especially nice to Jason at first, mostly because they wanted him to join, which is the same tactic they used previously to try and recruit others. While in the camp one day, Jason heard shouting, and he looked over to see James standing at attention, with Richard standing the same way right behind him. Gerald was beside James, clearly in charge, and yelling at Richard that he needed to learn more responsibility. Then Gerald said, "Okay, Dave," and right then, James punched Richard. Richard doubled over, fell to the ground, and started crying. James told him, "Get up," and Richard did. Jason said it was clear these guys weren't just hanging out. They acted more like a survivalist group. In their very first conversation, Gerald showed Jason around 30 different weapons. Gerald and his group had a dangerous obsession with weapons and military gear. They were regulars at gun shops and army surplus stores, always decked out in full camouflage outfits. They even set up military-style netting near their homes. Their arsenal was stockpiled with knives, firearms, and even grenades. At some point, Jason started dating a woman named Michelle "Missy" Evans. She was a meth user who wasn't well liked in the community and had a reputation for being violent and dishonest. She would split her time between her grandmother's home in Ripon and Jason's trailer. In January 1990, an alcoholic drug dealer named Franklin Raper moved his trailer into the camp near 65-year-old Elmer Bridges' cabin and about 50 feet from Gerald's apartment. Franklin was around 50 years old, 5'7", and weighed roughly 100 pounds. He sold drugs from his trailer at the camp, which caused constant noise and traffic. The residents hated this because shady people would visit the property all the time, and they would litter the property by throwing drug paraphernalia. Jason had actually been friends with Franklin before meeting Gerald and the others. He recalled a night when he passed out in Franklin's trailer, and when he woke up, Franklin and a man named David Jarman were there, but his .38 caliber gun had gone missing. From that point on, Jason no longer trusted Franklin. Franklin had several close friends who visited him regularly, including Little Debbie Smelser and James Fat Cat Smith. Franklin had a confrontational attitude and annoyed the others, especially Gerald and his group, and at some point, Gerald was overheard telling someone he wanted to get his hands on Franklin. Franklin would eventually become public enemy number 1 at the camp. Even before moving into the camp, Franklin was not a very well-liked person. Greg Boynton ran an auto repair shop in Salida Boulevard, and right next to it was a vacant lot. In October 1989, Franklin parked his trailer on the vacant lot and turned the place into a mess. He threw garbage and syringes everywhere, and there was a lot of sketchy people visiting late at night. Greg's business partner, David Anderson, said that Franklin would also throw rocks at customer cars. Tensions boiled over when Franklin made some disrespectful remarks about Greg's father during an argument. Greg responded by pushing Franklin to the ground, and later that same night, Franklin threw a wine bottle in front of their shop. A few days later, on October 13th, he showed up again, this time with Fat Cat, and told Greg, "This guy is going to kill you." Franklin also liked to spin donuts in the lot. On one occasion, he and Fat Cat started spinning donuts and their car stalled out. That's when Greg and his father, James, ran over and beat them. Greg hit Franklin in the head and ended up breaking his arm. Fat Cat then came at Greg with a chain, but David Anderson jumped in to help, and together, they managed to hold Fat Cat down until the police arrived. Franklin was sent to the hospital, and Fat Cat went to jail. Afterward, James had Franklin's trailer moved off the lot. But Franklin didn't disappear. Greg said he saw him around Salida often, and that Franklin would yell and threaten him, make insulting gestures, and once said he was going to get his father. Sergeant Jane Irwin described Franklin as all mouth and no actions. The other residents of the camp were fed up with Franklin, especially when he stole electricity by rigging an extension cord to Elmer's cabin, ran up the electricity bill, and then refused to pay his share of the bill. When Elmer finally cut the power, Franklin was enraged and was cursing at Elmer and threatening him, which infuriated Gerald, who had just taken over as property manager. The entire camp wanted Franklin gone, but he refused to leave. Robert Bowers, who had hired Gerald to help manage the camp, said that in February of 1990, he received complaints about Franklin's unauthorized trailer, but he did not know the occupant and took no steps to remove it. Around April 1990, Jason had a heated argument with Franklin and a man named Jimmy Smith. Franklin and Jimmy then went inside Franklin's trailer and locked the door. Jason snapped and started smashing the trailer with a baseball bat. Suddenly, Jimmy flung open the door and threw a lamp at Jason, hitting him in the arm. Jason then backed off and left. Residents had enough of Franklin, and they were determined to force him out of the camp by any means necessary. One April night, Gerald, James, Jason, Richard, and a man named Kevin Broshuel pounded on Franklin's trailer. David Jarman, who got along with everyone, entered the trailer, escorted Franklin out, and made him leave. They then towed Franklin's trailer several blocks away from the camp. James, Gerald, and Jason hooked up Franklin's trailer to James's van and relocated it to 5223 Elm Street. Minutes after towing Franklin's trailer, James, Gerald, David Williams, Jason, and Kevin pushed Franklin's car off the camp, and Jason doused the interior with gasoline from a can before someone set it on fire. A few days later, on the morning of April 16th, around 9:45 a.m., Stanislaus County Deputy Sheriff Brian Grimm met Gerald at the camp after a disturbance was reported. Later that same day, Deputy Grimm returned to the property after another call and saw a section of Gerald's fence that had been damaged. That fence was recently built by Jason and Richard. Gerald made a citizen's arrest, accusing Franklin of causing the damage. Deputy Grimm processed the arrest and took Franklin to jail, although he noted that by law he had to accept a citizen's arrest, even if it might not hold up in court. According to Deputy Grimm, Franklin wasn't violent or aggressive in any way toward him, but he did make a comment, saying he had the cash to post bail and would soon be back on the street to harass Gerald. After the fence incident, Gerald said Franklin gave him what he called an evil eye and told him better not press charges. Jason remembered Gerald saying that it would have been a lot easier if they had just went in the trailer and did him, referring to Franklin, rather than dealing with all this hassle. At some point, Franklin stood on the other side of a fence from Gerald, pulled a knife on him in front of Jennifer and their children, and said he was going to kill him. Jennifer confirmed this happening. Gerald said there were rumors going around that Franklin's biker friends might cause trouble for the camp. In response, he, James, and Richard started doing armed patrols around the perimeter. Gerald mentioned that he did report this to the local sheriff at some point. However, the police said that there was no evidence that these rumors were true. In the beginning of May 1990, Gerald reached out to Ronald Willey, someone he hadn't spoken to in about 8 months. Ronald had no idea where Gerald had been living, but he agreed to visit him at the camp. Once there, Ronald met Jason for the first time. Gerald, James, Jason, and Ronald gathered in a small trailer, and that night, Gerald had Jason sign a piece of paper, then cut his hand, and mark the paper with his bloody fingerprint. They then told him that he was officially joining their group. Ronald said he had done the exact same thing years earlier, back in '85 when he first met Gerald and James. Missy Evans and her younger half-sister Tanya Miller used to live at 5223 Elm Street, the same duplex Franklin's trailer was dumped at by Gerald's group. They lived there until April 1990, when Tanya got hit with a 30-day eviction notice. She left her furniture behind and moved in with their grandmother. Around May 10th, Tanya allowed Franklin and his friend Dennis Caldwell to stay in the now vacant Elm Street house until her eviction was finalized. After they moved in, Franklin and Dennis started inviting friends and strangers to crash there. Tanya asked them to leave multiple times, but they refused. Eventually, Tanya got a 3-day notice and became desperate to retrieve her furniture, so she asked Missy for help. On Friday, May 18th, around 9 p.m., Missy, Gerald, James, Jason, Ronald, and Richard headed over to the Elm Street house, supposedly to help move out a fridge and some furniture for Tanya. Franklin, Dennis, Richard Garfield Ritchie, Emmy Darlene Paris, Little Debbie, and Diane Kiernan were all at the house when Gerald and his group arrived. Gerald brought a 12-pack of beer as a friendly gesture, and everyone ended up drinking together. At first, the encounter was surprisingly civil until Jason suddenly accused Franklin of stealing one of his guns while he slept that one night, which actually turned out to be true. Franklin and Jason then had a short fist fight, and James and Ronald started wrestling with Richard. After the fight, Gerald's group stayed for another 15 minutes before leaving, without taking a single item they'd supposedly come for, or moving any furniture. The group headed back to the camp after about 45 minutes or so. Before leaving, Gerald asked Franklin if they could come back the next day to finish moving furniture, and Franklin said that it was fine. Later that same evening, Dennis drove past the camp in Franklin's car, creeping along at a suspiciously slow pace, as if he was surveilling the group. Gerald's group spotted him, and Gerald, James, Jason, Missy, and Ronald sprinted toward the vehicle. Ronald reached Dennis first, yanking him straight through the car window. What followed was a brutal beating, with the group members taking turns, all while Gerald was demanding Dennis to tell him what was going on at the Elm Street house. Jason and Ronald then stole Franklin's car and took it for a joyride. Along the way, they stopped to pee in the back seat of the car. About 10 minutes later, they brought it back to a battered Dennis who was waiting on the street. On May 20th, 1990, around noon, Fat Cat dropped by to visit Franklin at the Elm Street house. Richie and Dennis were also there at the time. A few hours later, sometime between 1 and 3 in the afternoon, Fat Cat noticed Jason visit the house next door. That evening, Richard showed up at the home of Deanne Messiner, Gerald's next-door neighbor. He was seen dressed in full camouflage and had a dark ski cap and black boots on, and was also carrying a baseball bat. Although Franklin had never physically hurt Gerald and his group, they decided he had to die that night, along with anyone unlucky enough to be near him. Gerald pulled Missy aside and asked her to draw a detailed floor plan of the house at 5223 Elm Street. While she sketched it out, Gerald sat nearby, sharpening a K-bar knife, a 10-inch fixed blade with serrations on one side. He then told Missy to call her sister Tanya and warn her not to go home tonight. Gerald also called Rosemary and asked her and her boyfriend, Philip Wallace, to come over to the apartment since he wanted Rosemary to stay with Jennifer. During that call, Gerald mentioned that the guys were going to go even a score at a house across the park in Salida. He said they were expecting a fight, and the score he wanted to settle was with someone named Fat Cat. That night, Ronald was at his place in Ceres with his girlfriend Patricia Badgett when Gerald called, allegedly asking for help moving furniture again at the Elm Street house. Ronald told him he wasn't feeling well, and if they can move it to a different day. Gerald called Ronald for a second time that night. He asked him to come over, and although Ronald was hesitant at first, he caved and agreed, and James picked him up. They arrived at the camp around 11:30 p.m., where Gerald, Missy, Jason, Ronald, and Richard were waiting in Jason's trailer. It was here that they were given assignments of what to do at the Elm Street house, and there were definitely no discussions about moving furniture. Gerald used the floor plan Missy had drawn to lay out the plan. They would surround the home, trap the residents, and kill everyone inside. Gerald said, "Go and do them all, and leave no witnesses." First, Missy and Jason would enter the house through the front door. Their job was to herd everyone into the living room, while Missy would count how many people were inside. Missy would then slip away to unlock a bedroom window for James and Richard. Meanwhile, Gerald and Ronald would burst in through the side door. Richard would recheck all the rooms to make sure that they were empty, and then block the hallway to prevent anyone from escaping. Gerald told them to beat and stab the victims because guns would make too much noise. Additionally, he said that any member who chickened out would be executed alongside the people in the Elm Street house. He also singled out a couple of potential targets. If Little Debbie was there, he said, she's his, and he hoped Fat Cat would be there too. Gerald also handed out 4 masks for himself, James, Ronald, and Richard, and everyone, except Missy and Jason, was dressed in camouflage. Around midnight, the group piled into Gerald's white Mercury Zephyr, and he drove them toward the Elm Street house. They were armed and ready. Missy and Jason were dropped off near the house first, and the rest then proceeded to park the car a little further away, somewhere Gerald thought Franklin's friends wouldn't spot his car. Then Gerald, James, Ronald, and Richard put on their camouflage paintball masks, and Richard also wore a ski cap. Jason had a gun hidden in his coat pocket, and he put a bat against the house, just outside the front door. Inside the Elm Street house, Franklin and Dennis were sitting in the living room, and Emmy Darlene Paris and Richard Garfield Ritchie were sitting in the kitchen. Donna Alvarez was asleep in the back bedroom, which was locked. Donna was homeless at the time, and was offered a place to sleep for the night by Ritchie. Jason and Missy went inside the home through the front door and started checking the rooms in the house. The garage and hallway rooms were empty, and the back bedroom door was locked. Jason then went into the front bedroom. Ritchie casually mentioned to Missy that Donna was in the back bedroom, so Missy knocked and ordered Donna out, saying that her sister needed the room. The moment Donna came out, Missy darted into the bedroom, locked the door behind her, and opened the window. She saw Gerald, James, Ronald, and Richard running toward the house with their masks on. Richard and James climbed through the bedroom window where Missy was standing, and then rushed straight toward the living room. Missy forgot to tell James there were 5 people in the house. James and Richard pulled out their knives before James headed down the hallway, while Richard cleared the closet and master bathroom before following James to the hallway. Meanwhile, Donna was in the living room and was asking Franklin where she could sleep. He then pointed her toward the front bedroom. Ritchie followed her, but when they opened the door, they saw Jason leaning against the far wall. He cocked his gun, pointed it at them, and told them to go back into the living room. Ritchie and Donna then ran back into the living room, and Donna didn't stop running until she reached the kitchen, where she hid behind a cupboard. Jason then climbed out the front bedroom window, circled around the house, and grabbed his bat from where he'd left it by the front door. As he went back inside, he saw Ritchie, Dennis, and Emmy walking towards the door, presumably trying to escape. Jason then swung his bat at them one by one, which caused them to fall back. Moments later, Ritchie saw an opening, and he darted past Jason and burst out the front door, running into the street, screaming, "Oh God, help me." Just as Ritchie made it outside, Gerald and Ronald were approaching the house. Gerald then yelled at Ronald, telling him to get him. Ronald then tackled Ritchie, sat on his back, and began beating him. The noise woke a neighbor, Earl Creekmore, who went outside just in time to witness the horrific assault. Gerald joined in, and together they picked Ritchie up only to slam him back down, over and over. They hit the back of his skull with their clenched fists and kicked him relentlessly as he begged for mercy. Ritchie screamed, "Please don't, no, please, and help me." When Earl asked what was happening, neither of the men answered. At one point, Gerald went inside the house briefly while Ronald continued to beat Ritchie. Ronald ended up stabbing Ritchie in the arm, abdomen, chest, and back. During the attack, Ritchie managed to yank the mask from Ronald's head. Inside the house, Donna managed to flee from the kitchen into the garage. She hid there under a pile of clothes for a bit, as she listened in terror to the sounds of people fighting in the house and Emmy screaming. Donna pushed against the broken garage door, forcing it open just enough to squeeze underneath and sprint to a neighbor's house. The neighbor's girlfriend immediately called 911. At some point, Missy decided to leave, and she sprinted back to the car. Inside the home, Jason came up to Franklin, who was still seated in his chair. As Franklin raised his arm in an attempt to protect himself, Jason swung his baseball bat, shattering Franklin's arm just above the wrist. But Jason wasn't done. He brought the bat down again and again, bludgeoning Franklin's head until it was deformed. Franklin's teeth and fragments of his denture were knocked out of his mouth, and his blood was sprayed all over the walls. Then Gerald joined the attack, hitting Franklin in the head multiple times with a baton, and he then stabbed him on the side of his neck before slitting his throat. Meanwhile, Richard cornered Emmy in the kitchen. She tried to hide beneath a table, but Richard dragged her out as she screamed, "Oh God, oh God, oh God." He repeatedly hit her, striking her head, face, chest, and even her anus with his bat, splattering blood across the walls, stove, and dishwasher. Gerald may have also hit her with his police baton. Richard plunged his knife into Emmy's neck and chest. He then cut her throat with such force that the cut reached her spine. James caught Dennis near the interior garage door. Either Richard or Gerald repeatedly beat Dennis's head with a knife handle, fracturing his skull and causing brain damage. Then James started stabbing Dennis repeatedly, slashing his face, scalp, neck, abdomen, and chest before cutting his neck. Gerald then stepped back outside to where Ronald was. Ronald moved aside and Gerald stood over Richie. Gerald bent down and grabbed Richie off the ground, and then he cut his throat. The cut extended all the way down to Richie's vertebrae. Gerald callously let Richie's body fall to the ground, leaving him to choke on his own blood. Earl said that Richie let out a chilling gurgle. As Earl began to leave, he looked back and saw Ronald swinging what looked like a 2x4 over his head. Gerald and Ronald then briefly walked back inside the house, and Earl rushed back to his house, and his girlfriend immediately called 911 twice. Minutes later, James, Ronald, Gerald, and Jason all came out of the house and were moving in single file, jogging east at a steady pace. All four men held their hands in a port arms position, one hand on the chest, the other raised toward the shoulder. Then they glanced down at the body in the street and got back to their getaway car, leaving behind a bunch of damning evidence which would later be collected by the police. When James, Gerald, Jason, Ronald, and Richard made it back to the car where Missy was waiting, James was drenched in blood and holding a bloody knife. Gerald had blood smeared on his hands, and Jason was clutching a bat also stained with blood. Ronald told Gerald to drive him back to his place in Ceres. No one said much at first during the car ride, but the silence didn't last long. Jason heard Gerald ask Missy how many people were in the house. She answered 5. Gerald then asked James, "Well, how many did we get?" James replied, 4. Gerald wasn't happy about that. He said, "Fuck," clearly upset that one had gotten away. Gerald followed up by asking, "Who all did we get?" James answered, "Dennis, some dude, a chick, and Frank." Gerald then asked, "They're all dead, aren't they?" And James replied, "Yeah." But Jason spoke up. He said, "Well, Frank ain't dead." James laughed and said, "He's dead. I seen his face crumble on the way out the door." James then said that it was a waste that they only got 3 dudes and a chick. Gerald said he was disappointed that little Debbie and Fat Cat hadn't been there because he would have liked to kill them. Ronald then said, "Someone watched us do the guy in the front yard," which sent Gerald into a rage. He said they should have killed the neighbor too, because there weren't supposed to be any witnesses. Richard also explained that he had tossed the K-bar knife, the bat, and the baton, trying to get rid of the evidence. Jason said that he wanted to toss his bat out the car window, but Gerald told him to hang on to it. Once they got to Ronald's house, he went straight to his bedroom, shut the door behind him, undressed, and headed to the bathroom. His hands were covered in blood, so he washed them off. His girlfriend Patricia was there too, and he told her to just stay in bed. The rest of the group all washed the blood off their bodies and clothes. Gerald told Richard to clean the blood off his shoes and make sure there was no blood in the car, and to grab a gun from the glove box, which he did. They then just chilled in the living room for a bit and started talking about what their alibis would be. Richard mentioned he'd left his hat at the scene, and both he and Ronald realized they'd also left their masks behind. They then gathered the rest of their weapons and masks and laid them out on a table. Then James, Ronald, and Richard hid some of the weapons underneath Ronald's house. Ronald also hid 2 guns, a .380 handgun that Richard had given him, and a pistol Jason had, up in the top of his closet. He also stashed the clip and some extra shells in his fishing tackle box. Later on, Missy asked Jason what happened inside the house. He looked frightened and told her, "Missy, it was the worst thing you ever want to see." He said Franklin had tried to raise his arm and that he'd smashed it with the bat, breaking it. He also said that he struck 3 other people as they tried to run, knocking them down one by one. Ronald walked back into the front room and showed Gerald to the phone. Gerald then called Jennifer and told her to grab some money, get the kids, take the van to Oakdale and get a motel room, and he said he'd meet her there. Gerald, James, and Richard then left Ronald's and joined Jennifer at the Oakdale motel. After they left, Ronald tossed his bloody clothes into the washing machine, rolled a joint, and smoked it with Missy. Both Missy and Jason ended up spending the night there. When Ronald finally crawled into bed, Patricia asked him what was going on, but he didn't give her much. All he said was, "Nothing went right, and you really don't want to know." The next morning, Ronald's roommate dropped Missy off at her grandma's place in Ripon and gave Jason a ride to his brother's house in Oakdale. After that, they went back to the camp, but when they saw the police there, they left. Jason ended up going to his friend Rick Ciccarelli's motel room, and Jason ended up telling Rick that he swung a bat at Franklin, hitting him hard enough to break his arm. Just 5 minutes after getting home, Ronald borrowed his roommate's car and drove out to the Tuolumne River at Laird Park. Once there, he poured gasoline on his clothes and shoes and set them on fire. He took 2 knives, one he had hidden under the house and another from his living room, and hid them under 2 concrete slabs along the riverbank. Then he tossed the bat into the water. Around 1 a.m. on the night of the murders, Stanislaus County Deputy Sheriff Charlie Corll got a call about an assault near Elm and Mason in Salida, and he arrived within minutes. There was an ambulance already there, and a body lying in the street. Donna Alvarez was still in shock, but she directed Sheriff Corll to the house at 5223 Elm Street. Outside the home, investigators found a blood-stained camouflage mask between Richie's legs. A knife was also discovered near Franklin's body. On the front lawn, they recovered a dark knit cap and another camo mask. They also found shoe prints in the gutter area in front of the house. Near the crime scene were some tire marks. In a field and in the same general area nearby, police discovered a Bianchi police baton, a smaller bloody aluminum bat, and a K-bar knife. About 15 feet from the knife was a knife sheath. Within just an hour of the murders, Donna was shown a photo lineup, and right away she identified Jason as one of the intruders. Franklin Raper suffered significant head injuries, likely from a blunt force object, likely inflicted by the police baton. The impact was so intense that it caused noticeable distortion to the shape of his head and face, with bone fragments being driven deep into his brain. Additionally, Franklin had been stabbed in the neck, with his right carotid artery and larynx cut. His left arm was also broken, and this was likely caused by the baseball bat. Franklin's blood contained alcohol, methamphetamine, amphetamine, and PCP. Dennis Caldwell had suffered a skull fracture, along with several cuts and stab wounds to his face. There were also multiple wounds to his skull, as well as stabbing and slicing wounds that cut his jugular vein, carotid artery, and larynx. He had a slicing wound to his liver, and there were additional stab wounds to his chest. Defensive wounds were found on his left hand. The official cause of death was the stab wounds to the neck and abdomen. Emmy Darlene Paris sustained a number of injuries, including multiple contusions and cuts to her scalp, likely caused by a blunt force instrument. Emmy's head injuries were consistent with being hit by the baton. She also had stab wounds to her neck and chest, along with defensive wounds on her hands. The official cause of death was determined to be a severed throat. The wound had cut her carotid vessels, jugular vein, and larynx, and had extended all the way down to her spine. Richard Garfield Ritchie suffered stab wounds to his neck, back, abdomen, and liver, along with several defensive wounds on his hands. There were also slicing wounds to his heart and pulmonary artery, leading to hemorrhaging in his chest cavity. His jugular vein, windpipe, and carotid artery were severely cut, with the wounds extending toward his spine. It was determined that either the injury to his chest or the one to his neck could have been fatal. The day after the murders, investigators searched Gerald's apartment. There were no sign of a K-bar knife or any camouflage masks, but they did seize evidence that would help with the investigation. Sylvia Zavala worked at Crescent Supply, and on February 27, 1990, she showed Gerald some camouflage masks that were identical to ones found at the scene of the murders. A receipt dated that same day was seized by the investigators in Gerald's home. It showed he bought 4 of those masks along with some camouflage clothing. James also admitted that he did recognize one of the camouflage masks found at the crime scene, and that it was the same kind he'd seen before at Gerald's house. Then, on March 13th, Gerald bought a K-bar knife, a military-style knife just like the one found at the crime scene. That receipt, too, was found in his home and showed he actually bought 2 knives that day. Steve Miller was working at a gun shop in Modesto called Gun Country when Gerald came in, accompanied by James. Gerald ended up buying a police baton, the same kind that was later found at the scene. A .380 caliber handgun, one that looked a lot like Donna said she saw Jason holding on the night of the murders, had been bought and registered to James. The purchase was made way back on July 25, 1989. Police also got a warrant to search Ronald's house. When Ronald showed up during the search, officers noticed fresh scabs on his wrist. Inside his home, there was only one newspaper, the May 22, 1990 edition of the Modesto Bee, and an article about the murders had been marked with a star. Additionally, a .22 caliber gun registered to James was found at Ronald's home. Blood matching Dennis's was found on Gerald's baton. Investigators also found blue fibers on the baton that matched the rare carpeting in Gerald's Zephyr. The blood on both the baseball bat and the K-bar knife was consistent with Emmy's. The camouflage masks had blood that matched Richie. Shoe prints in the gutter area in front of the house matched the size and type of shoes Missy was wearing, and the tire marks matched the unique tread on Gerald's car. The night after the murders, James stopped by to see Rosemary. She noticed he was wearing brand new sneakers. James was smiling and told her that his old shoes had gotten blood on them, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get them clean. Rosemary said James told her that they had to do them, meaning the people that were killed. James also had a conversation with Philip Wallace, who was an acquaintance. During that conversation, James said something along the lines of, "We or I slit some throats." Understandably, Philip was stunned. He responded with something like, "You're not serious." But instead of denying it or laughing it off, James just smirked. Missy also confessed to her friend of over a decade, Michelle Mercer, that she had been directly involved in Emmy's death. Michelle recalled Missy describing in graphic detail how Emmy was killed. It is important to note that Missy had a reputation for being a liar, and she might have said that to Michelle because just before the murders, Michelle saw Missy and Emmy together, partially undressed and kissing. Missy also said that she loved every minute of what Franklin got. Michelle claimed Missy said, "I watched Franklin die, and it was kind of neat." Missy reportedly thought Michelle was planning to hurt Missy's younger sister and responded by threatening her, saying she still had friends out there who could take care of her too. Gerald and his group were all arrested shortly after the murders. Gerald's girlfriend Jennifer was arrested as well. When detectives searched Gerald and Jennifer's home, they found pipe bombs and a bunch of guns and ammo. After leaving Ronald's house on the day of the murder, Gerald, Jessica, and their 2 kids stayed at a motel in Oakdale. The very next evening, Gerald and Jennifer were arrested on charges of possessing destructive devices. After finding this out, James tried to get bail for him that night, but ended up getting arrested himself. James then asked Bill Samao, a coworker, to help him out and sell his trailer for him, and to give Gerald a portion of the money. Not long after confessing to Rick Ciccarelli, Jason fled to Oregon, but his time on the run didn't last, and he was arrested there shortly after. A day after the murders, Missy asked her friend James Lee Richardson to help move some furniture, but as they were driving around picking stuff up, she apparently told him she had actually watched the murders happen and laughed about it. She even said she had planned them. Later, Ripon police caught up with her and placed her under arrest. Stanislaus County Sheriff's Detective Mark Ottoboni interviewed Missy the day of her arrest. At one point, the detective placed Missy and James in the same room and secretly watched as the two whispered to each other about the murders. After the murders, Gerald, while in jail, repeatedly called Jennifer and threatened her. These calls stopped just once he realized Jennifer would be testifying. She also received threatening calls from Stephen Perkins. Jennifer admitted that she lived in constant fear of James, knowing that he would do whatever Gerald told him to do. Linda Willis, James's half-sister, visited her brother in jail. James told her not to worry, saying, "I'm going to get out of this." He told her that Gerald had connections on the outside who were going to make sure of it, and that things were going to happen to people. When James's brother Stephen visited him in jail, he laughed and said, "If I had a chance to do it all over, I would." When asked about the serious charges against Gerald, Ozencio said he didn't believe his son had anything to do with them. But even if he did, he said he would only love him more. And if Gerald were sentenced to death, Ozencio said it would feel like a part of him died too. Hope said that she didn't believe her brother was capable of the horrific things he was accused of. But even if he had done them, she said, she would still love him. Despite everything, Marlene said she loved Gerald. But when it came to his sentencing, she believed that the death penalty would be a fair outcome. The prosecution ended up making a deal with Jennifer. If she testified truthfully in all the legal proceedings, she would have the bomb possession charge against her dropped. At trial, Gerald and James admitted they went to the Elm Street house that night, but they denied ever planning to kill Franklin. They claimed that just before midnight, Missy arrived at the camp and went up to Gerald and told him that she needed to grab clothes and a bridal gown that was an heirloom from the Elm Street house. They said that they only went to the house because Missy said that she needed Gerald and the others to come with her for protection. However, Missy and Ronald both testified saying that that wasn't true. Why would they bring 5 knives, 2 bats, a police baton, and a handgun just to pick up a few items, especially since they'd been to that house many times before unarmed? They claimed they armed themselves because Franklin had supposedly hired a motorcycle gang to visit their compound that same night and kill them all. However, there was zero proof that this was true. Gerald even left his pregnant girlfriend, Jennifer Starn, and their 2 young children alone at the camp, the very place the motorcycle gang was supposedly coming to attack. When questioned about this, James casually said Jennifer could protect the kids from the motorcycle gang with her own gun. Unsurprisingly, the jury saw right through their lies. They found Gerald Cruz and James Beck guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder and rejected all pleas for leniency. They were both sentenced to death on every count. Richard Vieira was found guilty of the same charges and was also sentenced to death. Michelle "Missy" Evans entered a plea agreement and was sentenced to 1 year in prison in exchange for her testimony. She only served 6 months in prison. Jason LaMarche and Ronald Willie were convicted of 4 counts of second-degree murder, and they were sentenced to 62 years in prison. Thank you for watching.